She clutched her purse the moment she saw him. A young black teen walking behind her on a quiet city sidewalk. Seconds later, she collapsed from a stroke. And the very boy she feared? He was the one who saved her life. What followed wasn't just a rescue. It was a journey of reckoning, forgiveness, and an unlikely friendship that shook an entire community. This is the story of how fear turned into grace, and how one courageous act rewrote 2 lives forever. Before we dive in, I'd love to know, where are you watching from today? Drop your city, your country, or even just a hello in the comments below. And as we begin this powerful story, get comfortable and stay with me until the end, because trust me, you won't want to miss a single moment. It was one of those early spring afternoons in downtown Chicago when the city hummed with life yet still carried a slight chill that urged people to keep their coats on. The sidewalks were alive with movement. People rushing home from work, students spilling out of buildings, and the occasional vendor calling out over the sound of traffic. Among them walked Margaret Whitaker, a 62-year-old retired librarian with snow-white hair tucked neatly beneath a floral scarf and a purse clutched firmly to her side. She had just picked up her prescription from the corner pharmacy and was heading toward the bus stop, her sensible shoes clicking gently on the pavement, her mind on the dinner she planned to make. Despite the ordinary calm of the afternoon, something shifted in her demeanor the moment she sensed someone behind her. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, though she couldn't have explained why. Glancing over her shoulder, she saw a teenage boy walking in her direction. A black boy, tall and lean, dressed in a gray hoodie and jeans, earbuds dangling from his ears. He looked to be no older than 17. In that instant, her breath caught slightly. Without thinking, she pulled her purse tighter under her arm and stepped a bit quicker. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He hadn't said a word. But still, her steps grew faster, her hand tighter around her bag's worn leather strap. When she reached the crosswalk, she didn't wait for the light to change. She simply crossed to the other side, telling herself it was because of the sun's glare. But deep down, she knew better. And as she turned back to glance once more, she saw the boy pause, look after her with a faint expression of confusion, then continue walking at his original pace, eyes cast downward. To him, it had been just another walk home from his volunteer shift at the local animal shelter, where he'd spent the past 2 hours cleaning cages and feeding stray kittens. His name was Jalen Carter, and he'd lived in the neighborhood all his life. Raised by his grandmother after his mother passed away when he was 9, Jalen had grown up learning how to cook Sunday dinners, recite bedtime prayers, and treat strangers with respect, even when they didn't return it. On that particular afternoon, he'd been replaying an old song in his head, lost in thoughts about an upcoming biology exam and whether he could scrape together enough money for a prom suit. He didn't even notice the woman's fearful glance or the way she had crossed the street to avoid him. But Margaret had noticed everything. Sitting now at the bus stop a block down, she kept one eye on the street and another on the boy as he approached, still not looking her way. Her fingers tapped restlessly on the edge of her purse, and she wondered whether she should pretend to make a phone call. It wasn't that she believed he'd hurt her. Not really, but a lifetime of unspoken caution, shaped by news headlines and whispered warnings, had molded her reactions. Still, something gnawed at her. A strange discomfort in the pit of her stomach that she couldn't quite name. Then, without warning, the discomfort turned physical. A sharp, stabbing pain burst through her head and radiated down her left side. Her vision blurred, her breath caught in her throat, and her body slumped forward, collapsing to the sidewalk like a marionette whose strings had been suddenly cut. For a moment, the city didn't notice. People passed, some slowing to stare, others hesitating in uncertainty. No one moved, but Jalen did. The moment he saw the older woman crumple, her purse slipping from her lap and spilling its contents onto the concrete, he ran. Not away from, straight to her. He knelt down beside her, hands trembling but focused, and gently turned her onto her side. Her lips were twitching, her speech slurred, one arm completely limp. Jalen didn't need a textbook to tell him this was a stroke. He'd seen it before in his grandmother just last year, and the memory of that night came flooding back. How she'd made it through because he'd called for help fast enough. Without wasting a second, He dialed 911 and began speaking with the calm precision of someone much older than his years. "I have a woman here, mid-60s maybe. She's having a stroke. She's conscious but can't speak. Left side is unresponsive. We're at the Madison and Clark bus stop, near the pharmacy." The dispatcher on the other end stayed on the line, giving him instructions as he continued to monitor her pulse, tilt her head gently, and reassure her softly, though she couldn't respond. "Help's on the way. You're going to be okay," he whispered, glancing around at the still silent crowd. A few people had begun to gather now, one man filming with his phone, another looking awkwardly from a distance. But it was the boy in the hoodie who held her hand, the boy she had feared only moments before. The same boy now acting with more courage and compassion than anyone else around. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. Jalen didn't move from her side. Margaret's eyes fluttered open briefly, trying to focus, trying to understand. He didn't know whether she recognized him or not, but in that moment it didn't matter. All that mattered was that she lived. The screech of tires against pavement and the wailing cry of the ambulance siren shattered the quiet standoff that had hovered around the bus stop just moments before. Jalen stayed crouched beside Margaret, his hand still gently gripping hers, whispering calming words she couldn't quite comprehend but could feel nonetheless in the steady warmth of his voice. His other hand clenched the phone, still pressed to his ear as the dispatcher guided him through what to do if her breathing changed, if her pulse weakened, if her eyes rolled back. But for now, she was still, blinking slowly, lips moving like she was trying to say something she couldn't quite form. A few more people had finally begun to gather. An older man in a business suit stood behind Jalen, offering nothing but a furrowed brow and folded arms, while a young woman recorded quietly from behind a potted street tree. Her phone pointed at them as if documenting a rare anomaly. Jalen didn't notice any of it. He was focused only on her. His mind moved with clarity he didn't know he had, replaying the instructions from last year when his grandmother had collapsed on the kitchen floor during a Sunday morning breakfast. Back then, he'd panicked until he remembered what the health worker had taught him at the community center. Act fast, stay calm, time is everything. This time, he didn't hesitate. The ambulance pulled up to the curb with a blast of diesel-scented urgency, and 2 EMTs burst out the back, equipment in hand. Jalen jumped to his feet, quickly backing away but not before giving them a full report. "She collapsed about 5 minutes ago. Sudden pain, slurred speech, left side unresponsive. She was conscious for most of it, but she's fading." One of the medics, a middle-aged woman with salt and pepper hair, raised an eyebrow at him. "You the one who called it in?" He nodded. "You did good, kid." And just like that, they were kneeling where he had just been, checking vitals, asking her name, gently lifting her onto the stretcher with practiced movements. Margaret's purse lay forgotten on the sidewalk, its contents scattered like a snapshot of her life. Bifocals, a pill bottle, a crossword puzzle folded into quarters, and a handkerchief monogrammed with a delicate M. Jalen quietly bent down and gathered her things, slipping them back into the bag and holding it carefully as the paramedics wheeled her toward the waiting ambulance. He hesitated when they opened the back doors. One of the EMTs turned to him. "You family?" Jalen opened his mouth, then paused. "No, but I was with her when it happened." The woman glanced back at Margaret, who stirred weakly, her lips forming what might have been his name, or a sound close to it. The EMT nodded toward the passenger door. "Right up front. We may need you." And just like that, Jalen found himself climbing into the seat of an ambulance, the city blurring past him in streaks of brick, steel, and glass as they sped toward the hospital. For the first time since it all began, his hands began to shake. He stared down at them, stained faintly with the grime of the sidewalk, clutching the old woman's purse like it was something sacred. The EMT in the back called out numbers and blood pressure readings as the driver barked updates into a radio, and Jalen sat in the middle of it all, a teenage boy who had simply been walking home minutes earlier, now caught in the gravity of someone else's crisis. At the hospital, everything moved fast. Nurses swarmed the stretcher, pushing Margaret through automatic doors that flung open with a hiss of cold air and fluorescent light. Jalen was told to wait in the ER lobby, and for the first time since she fell, he found himself alone. The adrenaline was wearing off, replaced by the growing weight of uncertainty. He had done what he could, but would she survive? And if she did, would she even remember him? Would she want to? The question stung more than he expected. He looked down again at her purse, now resting on the plastic chair beside him, and felt a strange mix of connection and distance. She had clutched that purse to protect herself from him. Now he held it to protect what little part of her he could. A nurse came out a few minutes later, a young black man with a clipboard and kind eyes. "You the young man who helped Mrs. Whitaker?" Jalen nodded. "She's stable. She's lucky. If you hadn't gotten her help when you did, the stroke could have been far worse. The doctors are monitoring her closely now. Her daughter's on the way." Jalen exhaled slowly, the tightness in his chest loosening just enough to breathe. The nurse clapped him gently on the shoulder before returning inside, leaving Jalen once again with his thoughts. He watched the waiting room fill and empty, time stretching like taffy. He didn't know how long he sat there, legs bouncing, eyes flitting toward every door that opened. Finally, a tall woman in a burgundy cardigan entered in a rush, scanning the room with worry painted across her face. When she saw the purse in his lap, she stopped. Were you with Margaret Whitaker?" He stood, rising slowly, unsure what to say. "Yes, I saw her fall. I called for help." Her eyes filled with tears instantly. She took a step closer. "You saved my mother's life." Jalen didn't know what to say. He just nodded. "I'm Ellen. Thank you. I don't even know your name." "Jalen," he said softly. "Jalen Carter." She looked at him a moment longer, her expression shifting, maybe trying to reconcile the image her mother had likely described with the boy now standing in front of her. She reached out and took the purse gently from his hands. "She's going to want to thank you herself," she whispered, "when she wakes up." And in that moment, Jalen realized this story wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The humming fluorescent lights in the emergency room flickered with their usual indifference, casting a pale glow over the rows of plastic chairs and faded posters warning about flu shots and heart attack symptoms. Jalen sat alone, elbows on his knees, staring down at his scuffed-up sneakers. The adrenaline that had propelled him through the crisis had begun to evaporate, leaving behind a quiet weight that settled over his shoulders like a wet blanket. He had never been in this hospital before, though it felt vaguely familiar from the time he'd visited his grandmother in another one across town. Hospitals all smelled the same, clean, but not in a comforting way. More like disinfectant trying too hard to scrub away the chaos. Nurses moved briskly, heads down, intent on their tasks, while patients coughed and sighed around him. Somewhere down the corridor, a baby cried. He rubbed his hands together, as if trying to coax warmth or courage out of his palms. Every few minutes, he looked toward the swinging double doors that Margaret had disappeared through, half hoping a doctor would come out and tell him something, anything, even though he wasn't family and probably didn't have the right to ask. Still, a part of him felt responsible, not in a burdensome way, but in a way that made his chest ache with concern. He didn't know this woman. She didn't know him. And yet here he was, waiting to hear if she'd live. Just then, the doors whooshed open again and a woman in her early 40s stepped into the lobby. She had a worried look about her, clutching her car keys and phone like lifelines. Her eyes darted across the room until they landed on Jalen. She paused, a mix of confusion and recognition washing over her face. "Are you Jalen?" she asked. He nodded, standing awkwardly. "Yes, ma'am." She stepped closer, her voice softening. "I'm Ellen, Margaret's daughter." He extended his hand, and she took it, holding on a second longer than necessary. "They told me what you did. The nurse said you stayed with her, called for help, rode in the ambulance. You saved her." Jalen shifted, unsure of what to say. "I just did what anyone would have done." She smiled faintly, shaking her head. "No, not everyone would have. But you did." A nurse appeared beside them, clipboard in hand. "Ms. Whitaker is stable. She's been moved to a room for observation. She's conscious, but she's still weak. Only one visitor allowed at a time for now." Ellen turned to Jalen. Would you like to come with me? He hesitated. Are you sure? Yes, she said firmly. You were there. You deserve to see her. Together they followed the nurse down a long hallway that smelled faintly of antiseptic and something else Jalen couldn't quite place. Maybe fear or hope or both. The walls were lined with framed paintings of sunflowers and calming landscapes, an attempt to soften the reality of the place. When they reached the room, the nurse opened the door and stepped aside. Jalen caught a glimpse of Margaret lying in a bed, pale but alert, her head propped on a pillow, tubes snaking from her arm. Her eyes were closed, but when Ellen stepped inside and spoke softly, they fluttered open. Mom, there's someone here to see you, Ellen said gently. Margaret turned her head slowly, her gaze landing on Jalen. For a moment, silence filled the room, thick and uncertain. Then she whispered, barely audible, You? Jalen took a cautious step forward. Hi, ma'am. I'm glad you're okay. Her lips moved again, trying to form words, but her voice was fragile. Ellen pulled a chair over and motioned for Jalen to sit. He eased into it, careful not to disturb anything, and looked at Margaret, who was studying him with tired eyes that held something more than just gratitude. Something closer to confusion, maybe even guilt. I remember. The bus stop, she said, her words slow and slurred but clear enough. Jalen nodded. You collapsed. I called for help. Rode with you here. Her eyes welled with tears. I thought you were. She didn't finish the sentence, but he understood. He didn't flinch, didn't pull away. He just said, It's okay. You were scared. But I wasn't going to hurt you. Ellen watched the exchange quietly, her hand resting on her mother's shoulder. Jalen, she said softly. My mother has always been cautious, sometimes too cautious. Margaret turned her head slightly, eyes still on the boy who had saved her. I was wrong, she murmured. So wrong. Her voice cracked. Jalen looked down at his hands again, the same hands that had held hers on the sidewalk, that had picked up her scattered belongings from the concrete. It's all right, he said gently. I'm just glad you're okay. They sat in silence for a moment, the monitor beside the bed beeping steadily, measuring each heartbeat like a metronome ticking away the weight of old assumptions. After a while, the nurse returned to adjust Margaret's for, signaling it was time to leave. Ellen stood and placed a hand on Jalen's back. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for not walking away. As they left the room, Margaret watched him go with an expression that mingled sorrow and awe, as if trying to comprehend the strange, beautiful truth that the boy she had feared had not only stood by her but had held her life in his hands, and never let go. The days that followed passed in a haze of white walls, antiseptic smells, and the steady hum of hospital machinery. Margaret remained in the ICU under careful observation, her condition stable but uncertain. The stroke had left her weakened, especially on her left side, and her speech, while slowly returning, came in fractured syllables that left her frustrated and withdrawn. Doctors monitored her progress cautiously, adjusting medications, encouraging small movements, and assessing her capacity to recover. It was a battle now between time and resilience, and though she didn't say it aloud, Ellen could see the fear in her mother's eyes, the quiet dread that perhaps she wouldn't come back fully from this. Yet beneath that fear was something else, something less visible but no less potent. A question that had rooted itself in Margaret's heart, seated in those brief seconds of clarity when she first opened her eyes and saw the boy sitting beside her. Who was he, really? And why had she assumed the worst? Jalen had returned to the hospital twice since that first visit. The second time, he brought a bouquet of flowers, sunflowers, the only kind he could find at the corner store on short notice. He didn't know much about flowers, only that they looked warm, bright, and hopeful. Margaret had been sleeping when he arrived, so he left them on the table by her window, along with a small note that simply said, Wishing you strength. Jalen. He didn't expect a response. He hadn't come for recognition, but he felt, deep down, that something unresolved still lingered between them, something that could not be left untouched. That night, as he sat on the worn couch in his grandmother's living room, He tried to put words to what he was feeling. His grandmother, Miss Gloria, listened quietly as he recounted the details. How the woman had looked at him, how she had crossed the street, how her fear had been so loud it needed no words, and then how she had fallen, how he had run toward her, not away. Miss Gloria nodded solemnly. Sometimes, she said softly, people carry fear like an old coat. Doesn't matter if it's sunny outside or if you're offering them an umbrella. They'll hold onto that coat like it's part of who they are. Jalen looked at his hands again. I didn't think she'd be so scared. I wasn't doing anything. I know, Miss Gloria said. But it wasn't about what you were doing. It was about what she was told to believe long before you ever walked by. That truth hung in the air, heavy and familiar. They'd had versions of this conversation before. After a teacher assumed Jalen cheated on a test because he scored too high. After a security guard followed him around a store without reason. After a neighbor clutched her bag tighter when he waved hello. He was no stranger to the silent judgments that met him in everyday places. But this time felt different. This time, he had been close enough to see the fear turn into helplessness, and then into something else entirely. Back at the hospital, Ellen sat beside her mother's bed, peeling a clementine slowly, segment by segment. Margaret's eyes were fixed on the flowers by the window, her mind tracing back over everything. He was kind, she said quietly. Gentle. Ellen nodded. He's a good kid. Volunteers at the animal shelter. Wants to be a veterinarian someday. Margaret closed her eyes. I didn't see that. I only saw. She didn't finish the sentence, but Ellen reached over and took her hand. You were afraid, but now you know better. Margaret turned her head. Do I? The question was honest, laced with regret. Knowing better means doing better, right? That night, Ellen found herself scrolling through social media, searching for something she couldn't quite define. She came across a local community page and posted a simple message. To the young man named Jalen Carter who helped my mother during her stroke at the Madison and Clark bus stop, thank you. You saved her life. We are forever grateful. She attached a photo of Margaret's sunflowers, their golden heads tilted toward the light. The response was overwhelming. Dozens of comments poured in. People shared their admiration for Jalen, stories of similar kindnesses, and reflections on the assumptions they, too, had made about people based on appearances. A nurse from the hospital replied, sharing how composed and mature Jalen had been during the emergency. Someone else posted that they recognized him from the animal shelter and called him the kid with the big heart. The next morning, Margaret asked Ellen if Jalen might come back to visit. Ellen smiled gently. I'm sure he'd like that. But what neither of them knew yet was that Jalen was already planning to return. Not for recognition, but because something inside him told him this wasn't just a passing moment. It had become something deeper, a bond neither of them had expected, born not from familiarity or shared experience, but from an act of instinctual compassion that had shattered a wall built over decades. A life had hung in the balance, and because of him it had not fallen. But even more than that, something else had shifted. A soul that once saw danger in a silhouette had begun to see humanity in a face. Margaret Whitaker had always considered herself a fair-minded woman. She paid her taxes, donated gently used clothes to charity every winter, and waved politely at neighbors of all backgrounds during her daily walks. She read the newspaper front to back every morning, always finishing the crossword puzzle in ink, and taught her daughter to treat others with kindness, even when the world didn't return it. But now, as she lay in the quiet solitude of her hospital room, staring at the sunflowers turning faintly toward the filtered light, she began to confront the uncomfortable truth that fairness wasn't always the same as understanding, and politeness didn't always mean open-mindedness. Her hands, pale and trembling slightly, rested over the hospital blanket as if she could anchor herself there. The boy, Jalen, had done nothing but walk behind her, and in response, she had reacted with fear so deep and instinctual that she hadn't even questioned it. She had crossed the street, clutched her purse, convinced herself she was only being careful, when in truth she had allowed a reflex, born not from fact, but from decades of unspoken warnings, to govern her response to a young man who had meant her no harm. And then that very boy, that same silhouette she'd seen as a threat, had become her guardian. He had not only helped her, he had quite literally saved her life. Her daughter, Ellen, sat beside her now, reading aloud from a novel Margaret used to love. Her voice was soft, rhythmic, grounding. Yet even the comfort of familiar prose could not silence the flood of thoughts that filled Margaret's mind. She recalled 100 small moments across her life, crossing the street at night, locking the car door at stoplights, flinching slightly when someone who didn't look like her got too close. It was never dramatic, never overt. She would have denied it if asked, insisted she didn't see color, that she judged people by their actions, not appearances. And yet here she was, confronted by her own contradiction. Ellen turned the page and looked up. "You want me to keep going? Or are you tired?" Margaret shook her head. "I'm thinking," she said softly. Ellen closed the book and waited. After a long pause, Margaret spoke again. "I don't know where it came from, this fear, but I think it's always been there." Ellen nodded, saying nothing. "When I was a little girl," Margaret continued, "we didn't have many black families in our neighborhood. I remember my mother always told me to hold my purse close when we went into the city. She never said why. She didn't have to. I just learned." She looked at her daughter with shame in her eyes. "And I never questioned it." Ellen reached over and took her mother's hand. "A lot of people learn that way, but it doesn't mean we can't unlearn it." Margaret looked away, embarrassed by how deeply that fear had planted itself in her. "I saw a young man walking behind me, and I didn't see someone's son, or a student, or someone with dreams. I just saw danger, and he saw a human being." She paused, tears rising but not falling. "He saw me." That last part stuck in her throat like a confession. For the first time, she understood what it meant to be seen, not for what you were assumed to be, but for what you actually were. And the sting of knowing she had failed to extend that same grace cut deeper than any physical pain her body had endured since the stroke. Ellen gently brushed her thumb across her mother's knuckles. "He'll be back soon." He asked if he could visit again. Margaret's heart tightened with nerves. "What do I even say?" Ellen smiled. "Start with thank you. Then maybe ask about his life. Listen." That afternoon, Margaret dozed lightly, and in her dreams she walked through a long corridor filled with reflections. Mirrors on either side, showing images of herself at different ages. In each one, she saw the same subtle expressions of guardedness, the same practiced caution. But as she moved farther down the hallway, those reflections began to shift, softening, transforming into images not just of herself, but of faces she had overlooked. Jalen's face appeared near the end, calm, steady, not accusing, just present. She awoke with tears in her eyes and an unexpected feeling in her chest. Hope, not the naive kind that things would fix themselves, but the kind that whispered change might still be possible, even now, even after all this time. Later that evening, Margaret asked Ellen to bring her some of her old photo albums. Together, they flipped through pages of black and white memories, birthdays, summer picnics, school recitals. In nearly every picture, the faces looked like theirs. Homogeneous, safe, comfortable. "I never realized how small my world was," Margaret said quietly. "I thought it was wide, but it was just familiar." Ellen looked at her mother not with judgment, but with admiration for her honesty. "It's never too late to widen it, Mom. You're already doing it." Outside the hospital, the city continued moving. Cars honking, people rushing, lives unfolding moment by moment. And somewhere in that rush, a 17-year-old boy with a backpack slung over his shoulder and kindness in his heart prepared to visit a woman who had once feared him, not knowing that his presence had already started to unravel a lifetime of inherited beliefs. He didn't do it with speeches or grand gestures. He did it with a simple act of care, given freely without demand, in a moment when she needed it most. Margaret's life had been spared by his hands, but her heart was being reshaped by the truth of who he was. A young man who had every reason to walk away, and every reason not to care, but chose instead to see a person in need and respond with compassion. And that, she was beginning to realize, was the kind of bravery that changed more than just one life. It changed too. The following morning arrived dressed in a soft gray sky, the kind that made the world feel quieter somehow, as if time itself had decided to slow down. Margaret lay propped up in her hospital bed, her frame still fragile, but her eyes more alert than they had been in days. She had slept uneasily, the weight of self-reflection pressing gently against her chest. But as she watched the faint drizzle streak down the window pane, she felt something new beginning to stir, something like readiness. There was a knock at the door, light and hesitant. Ellen, seated beside her, looked up from her tablet and smiled knowingly before standing to open it. In the hallway stood Jalen, backpack slung over one shoulder, his shoes damp from the rain and his hands nervously stuffed into the pockets of his jacket. "Hi," he said quietly. I just wanted to stop by again, if that's okay." Ellen opened the door wider. "Of course. Come in." Margaret's heart fluttered as she watched him step into the room, every detail of his appearance more vivid now than it had been in her blurred memories from the ambulance. The softness in his eyes, the gentleness of his movements, the quiet confidence of someone older than his years. Jalen looked at her carefully, unsure if he was welcome, unsure what she might say, or if she'd even want to see him again. Margaret, gathering what strength she had, offered a small, earnest smile. "Hello, Jalen." Her voice was steadier than she expected. "Thank you for coming." Jalen nodded, stepping forward, then paused, unsure whether to sit or stay standing. Margaret gestured weakly toward the chair beside her bed. "Please sit." As he did, a moment of silence passed between them. Not awkward, but thoughtful, as if both were waiting for the right air to breathe before speaking again. "I wasn't sure if you'd want to see me," Jalen admitted after a moment. "I know. That day, before everything happened, you looked scared." Margaret took a slow breath. "I was," she said honestly. "Not because of anything you did, but because of something I had been taught to feel." Jalen looked down at his hands. "People look at me like that a lot. Like I'm a problem. Like they have to keep their distance. I've gotten used to it, I guess." She shook her head gently. "No one should have to get used to that." He glanced up, meeting her gaze. "But you didn't walk away," she added, voice thick with emotion. "You helped me. You saved me. You didn't hesitate, even though I did." Jalen shrugged. "My grandma always says, you don't need a reason to do the right thing. You just need to be ready when the moment comes." Margaret smiled faintly. "Your grandmother sounds like a very wise woman." "She is," he said proudly. "She raised me. My mom passed away when I was 9. My grandma took me in. She taught me how to cook, how to iron a shirt, how to tell the truth even when it's hard." His voice softened. "She also taught me not to judge people too fast, to look past what I see on the outside." Margaret nodded slowly, her chest tightening. "I wish I had learned that sooner." The words hung between them like a fragile bridge forming. "I think part of me always thought I was doing the right thing by being cautious. You grow up hearing so many things on the news, from neighbors, even from family. You start to believe those things without realizing it. And then one day, those beliefs nearly cost you everything." Jalen listened, not with resentment, but with the quiet patience of someone who had spent his life carrying other people's assumptions. "It's hard to change what you've been taught," he said gently. "But you can. My grandma says the heart's like a muscle. It gets stronger the more you use it, even if it's been still for a long time." Their eyes met, and for the first time, Margaret felt truly seen. Not as a victim or a patient, not as a woman who had once been afraid, but as someone trying to grow. She reached out slowly, her hand trembling slightly as it hovered between them. Jalen didn't hesitate. He reached forward and took it, his hand warm and steady, just as it had been on the sidewalk that day. Ellen, watching quietly from the side, felt something shift in the room, something subtle but profound. It wasn't dramatic. There were no grand declarations or tearful embraces, just a shared understanding, a small beginning of something that might, in time, become trust. Jalen stayed for nearly an hour, telling Margaret about the shelter animals he worked with, especially a parrot who barked like a dog and a chubby cat named Button who refused to eat anything but tuna. Margaret laughed softly at his stories, her voice still thin but growing stronger with each word. In return, she told him about her time as a librarian, about the children's reading programs she once led, and how much she had missed being around young people. They discovered a shared love for classic books. Jalen had a surprising fondness for Steinbeck, and Margaret promised to bring him a copy of East of Eden, with her notes in the margins once she returned home. When it was time for Jalen to leave, Margaret squeezed his hand one last time. "Thank you," she said again, her voice thick with meaning, "not just for saving my life, but for coming back." He nodded, smiling softly. "I'm glad I did." As he turned to leave, he paused at the door and looked back. "I'll come by again, if that's all right." "I'd like that very much," Margaret replied. And with that, the boy she had once feared stepped quietly out of the room, leaving behind something far more lasting than words. A presence that had begun to mend something long broken, not just in her body, but in her spirit. The hospital days rolled on with a kind of quiet rhythm, marked by nurse check-ins, physical therapy exercises, and the slow but determined healing of Margaret's body. Yet something else was healing, too. Something invisible, more delicate, and far more complicated. It had begun with a handshake between a young man and an older woman who had once feared him. But as the visits continued, that tentative thread began to strengthen, stretching carefully across the divide of decades, experience, and assumptions. Jalen visited every other afternoon, always bringing something small. A crossword book, a chocolate bar, a story from the shelter, or simply his time. Margaret, in turn, offered stories of her own, pulled from years spent surrounded by books, children's laughter, and the quiet order of libraries where she had once found purpose. It was through these conversations that they discovered a surprising number of things in common: an appreciation for old jazz records, a shared dislike for bland cafeteria food, and, most notably, a love of words. Jalen had a natural storyteller's charm when he spoke. His hands moved as he talked, sketching images in the air, drawing laughter even from Margaret's weary chest. One afternoon, he confessed to her that he kept a notebook in his room filled with poems he hadn't shared with anyone. Margaret's eyes lit up. "You should bring them," she said. "I'd love to hear them." He shrugged modestly. "They're probably not very good." She leaned forward, her voice firm. "Words don't need to be perfect. They just need to be true." Encouraged, Jalen brought the notebook the next day. The pages were worn, corners dog-eared. Some words scratched out, others circled. As he read aloud, Margaret listened intently, her gaze never leaving his face. His words weren't polished, but they were powerful, honest reflections on growing up in a world that often looked through him, on grief that clung like fog, and on unexpected kindness that cracked through concrete walls. She was moved, not only by the writing itself but by the courage it took to share it. "You have a gift," she told him quietly. "Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." He smiled, but there was a hesitation behind his eyes. "It's not easy putting yourself out there," he said. "Sometimes, it feels like no one wants to hear what I have to say." Margaret reached for his hand. "Then say it louder." Their bond deepened with each visit, not as grandmother and grandson, nor as patient and volunteer, but as two people who had seen each other's vulnerability and stayed. Word spread slowly through the hospital staff of the unlikely friendship forming in room 412. A few nurses began stopping by longer than usual, drawn in by the soft laughter that drifted through the door, or the sight of Jalen reading aloud from Langston Hughes while Margaret followed along with a faded copy from her nightstand. Even Ellen, who had once hovered nervously over her mother's recovery, now sat back during the visits, watching with a kind of quiet reverence. She could see her mother changing, becoming lighter somehow, not just from physical healing but from the shedding of something heavier than pain: guilt, fear, and the burden of inherited mistrust. One afternoon, Margaret surprised Jalen with a small wrapped gift. "For you," she said, her fingers trembling with excitement. Inside was a vintage leather-bound journal, its first page inscribed in neat cursive, "To Jalen, may your words always find light." He turned the journal over in his hands, blinking hard. "This is wow. Thank you." "It belonged to my husband," she explained. "He was a man of quiet thoughts, always jotting things down. I think he'd be happy knowing it's in your hands now." Jalen opened the cover again, touching the edge of the paper like it might vanish. "I'll fill it," he said. Every page. Their connection, once improbable, now felt undeniable. Margaret had begun calling him my friend. Not in the way polite people often do to strangers, but with warmth and sincerity. Jalen, in turn, began confiding more openly. Not just about school or the shelter, but about his dreams, his fears, and how strange it was to feel seen in a place where he had once only felt invisible. They had become, in many ways, mirrors for each other, reflecting back not who they had been told to be, but who they truly were beneath the surface. One evening, as a storm rolled in and thunder rumbled low in the distance, Margaret looked at Jalen and said, "I used to believe bridges were built with caution and structure. Now I think they're built with courage and a willingness to meet someone halfway." Jalen nodded. Sometimes all it takes is a single step, and with that single step, a bridge had begun to form. Slowly, steadily, across generations and prejudice, between two people who had every reason to remain strangers, yet chose not to. It was a bridge not just of healing, but of possibility. A path to something better, stronger, and more honest than either had expected when their lives first collided on that ordinary city sidewalk. It started with a simple post, a snapshot of a sunflower bouquet resting against a hospital window, captioned with a short message from Ellen. "To the young man who stayed with my mother, who called for help and saved her life, thank you. Your kindness changed everything." She didn't expect much from it. Maybe a few supportive comments from friends or distant cousins, maybe a message or two from neighbors. But within hours, the post had taken on a life of its own, shared across neighborhood pages, community groups, and even picked up by a local news blog that wrote a brief article titled, "Teen's Heroic Act Sparks Unexpected Friendship." Jalen's name, once known only to those in his small corner of the city, began appearing in comment threads filled with praise, awe, and, in some cases, introspection. People wrote about how the story had touched them, made them think twice, reminded them of kindness they'd received or overlooked. Strangers debated the quiet courage it took to act without reward, to stay when it would have been easier to walk away. But beyond the applause and admiration, something subtler and more powerful began to unfold. People started looking at one another a little differently. In the days that followed, the ripple spread. The owner of the local coffee shop, who had once eyed certain teens with suspicion, started greeting each young customer with a warmer tone and a genuine smile. At the church around the corner from the hospital, a pastor referenced the story during Sunday service, using it to speak about grace, redemption, and the danger of quiet prejudice. A teacher at Jalen's school printed the article and pinned it on the classroom wall under the heading "Compassion in Action." Conversations emerged in book clubs and barbershops, whispered in line at the grocery store and over backyard fences. People didn't just talk about what Jalen had done, they talked about what Margaret had learned. Her confession, shared by Ellen in a follow-up post, struck a nerve that many had long avoided. "I was afraid because of what I'd been taught," she had admitted. "But that fear was never about him, it was about me and the lies I'd never questioned." That honesty, raw and unguarded, stirred something rare. It allowed people to admit to their own blind spots without shame, to examine the quiet ways in which they'd misjudged others, not with malice, but with inherited fear, much like Margaret had. Margaret herself, still recovering but stronger by the day, began receiving letters. Some came from old friends, others from complete strangers. Mothers, teachers, veterans, young students, each one sharing their thanks, their stories, their own awakenings. One letter came from a woman named Dolores who had grown up in the same neighborhood and remembered being told the same warnings about who to avoid, who to fear. "I never questioned it," Dolores wrote, "until I read what you said. Thank you for helping me see what I hadn't seen before." Margaret read each letter slowly, sometimes twice, the words soaking into her like medicine for a part of her heart she hadn't known was sick. She replied to as many as she could, often with Ellen's help, and signed each one simply, "With gratitude, Margaret Whitaker." Jalen, meanwhile, found himself the subject of attention he hadn't asked for. Reporters called, teachers applauded him, and even the mayor's office sent a letter of recognition. But Jalen remained grounded, never letting the spotlight distract from what truly mattered to him. "I didn't do anything special," he told one reporter. "I just helped someone who needed it." When asked about Margaret, he smiled. "She's my friend. That's what matters most." Still, the sudden surge of attention brought changes he hadn't anticipated. People at school who had barely spoken to him before now nodded hello in the hallways. A local youth program invited him to speak about kindness and leadership. And at the animal shelter, donations increased after a volunteer mentioned him during a live stream fundraiser, attributing the story's lesson to the hearts of the young people who walked through their doors every day. But the most meaningful shift wasn't found in headlines or accolades. It was in the small, almost invisible transformations happening all around. A woman on the bus who, just weeks before, might have clutched her bag tighter now smiled and offered her seat to a tired young man. A father walking with his daughter in the park paused to let her pet a dog held by a teenager in a hoodie, trusting the moment rather than fearing it. Neighbors who had lived side by side for years finally spoke, not just with polite nods but with genuine interest. And slowly, like snow melting in early spring, something long frozen began to soften in the city's collective spirit. Margaret watched it all unfold from the hospital and then from the comfort of her daughter's home, where she recovered in a quiet upstairs room with a view of a maple tree. She and Jalen continued their visits, now punctuated with laughter, poems, and the exchange of ideas that stretched beyond age, race, or past misunderstandings. In him, she saw not just the boy who had saved her, but the boy who had challenged everything she thought she knew. And in herself, she saw someone not yet finished growing. One afternoon, as they sat together flipping through one of Margaret's old photo albums, Jalen pointed to a picture of her younger self, standing tall in front of a library with a stack of books in her arms. "You look proud," he said. Margaret smiled. I loved helping people discover new worlds through words." Jalen leaned back. "You still do." And in that simple statement, spoken without fanfare, Margaret felt the truth land softly in her chest. She was, at last, part of a new chapter, not just in her story, but in one that now stretched far beyond her own, rippling outward in ways neither of them could fully see yet, but both could feel growing stronger by the day. The invitation came folded neatly in an envelope with a Gold City emblem pressed into the flap. Inside, the card read, "Community Forum on Bridging Divides, a night of stories and healing. You are warmly invited to speak." It was addressed to Margaret Whitaker. At first, she assumed it had been sent by mistake. Her speech had never been more than polite small talk, her thoughts usually private, buried in journal pages or whispered to Ellen during quiet afternoons. But the name was hers, the address correct. She placed the card on her nightstand and stared at it for the better part of the evening, the same way one might stare at a mirror and wonder if the reflection is asking a question. When Ellen came in to check on her, Margaret held the invitation in both hands. "They want me to speak," she said softly. "At a community forum." Ellen read the card and nodded. "It's an opportunity, Mom, to share what you've learned, to help others see what you've come to see." Margaret looked uncertain. "But I'm not a speaker. I'm not a leader or an activist." Ellen smiled gently. "You're a human being who made a mistake and had the courage to face it. That's more powerful than any podium." For the next week, Margaret sat with a yellow notepad in her lap, scratching down sentences, crossing out entire paragraphs, starting over again and again. Some words came easily, others stuck in her throat, thick with emotion. But every time she thought about giving up, she thought of Jalen. His steady hands, his quiet bravery, the way he had returned again and again not for praise, but for connection. She thought of the photo album they had flipped through, the laughter they shared, the old notions he had so gently undone. And so, slowly, painfully, she found the words. On the night of the forum, the community center auditorium buzzed with anticipation. Rows of folding chairs filled the space, the stage modest but bright beneath soft yellow lights. Local leaders, clergy members, Teachers, parents, and students gathered in quiet clusters, many of them holding coffee cups or programs printed with the evening's theme, Bridging the Divide, Stories of Change. Margaret arrived early, assisted by Ellen, who stayed by her side as she settled into a seat near the front. Her hands trembled slightly, but her spine was straight, her gaze calm. Jalen arrived shortly after, dressed in his best collared shirt, the same journal she had given him tucked under his arm. When he saw her, he smiled and walked over, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze. "You're going to do great," he whispered. "Just speak from your heart." She nodded, not trusting her voice. When it was her turn, a hush fell over the room as she made her way to the podium. She stood for a moment in silence, surveying the faces before her. Young, old, black, white, familiar and unfamiliar, all waiting. She took a breath. "My name is Margaret Whittaker," she began, her voice soft but clear. "And not long ago, I was the woman who clutched her purse when she saw a young black man walking behind her. I was the woman who crossed the street, not out of caution, but out of fear. A fear I never questioned. A fear I inherited and carried quietly for years, convincing myself it was common sense, not prejudice. That fear nearly cost me my life." The audience was still riveted. "I suffered a stroke on that sidewalk. My legs collapsed beneath me, my breath vanished, and the world went sideways. And the only person who stopped, who helped, who stayed with me all the way to the hospital, was the same young man I had been afraid of just seconds earlier." Margaret paused, her eyes landing on Jalen in the front row. "His name is Jalen Carter, and he is one of the most decent, kind-hearted souls I have ever met. He didn't ask questions. He didn't hold a grudge. He just saw a person in need and acted." Her voice cracked then, but she steadied herself. "That moment broke something open in me. It forced me to face the truth I'd buried under decades of polite silence. I had let the world teach me who to fear, and I had never questioned the lesson. But Jalen taught me something new, that courage can come from anyone, and that real healing begins with honesty." A few people in the audience dabbed at their eyes. Some leaned forward, visibly moved. "This is my apology," she continued. "Not just to Jalen, though I've said it to him already. This is for anyone I ever judged without knowing. Anyone I ever passed by with a suspicious glance. Anyone I ever made feel small because of the color of their skin. I'm sorry, and I'm trying to be better, to learn, to listen. And I'm here tonight because I want to say that change is possible. I'm proof of it, and so is Jalen." When she stepped down from the stage, the audience stood, not with loud applause or fanfare, but with quiet reverence, the kind that comes not from spectacle but from truth. Jalen rose and met her halfway down the aisle, wrapping her in a gentle hug that said more than any speech could. That moment was captured by someone in the back row. A simple photo of an elderly white woman and a young black teen embracing in the center of a room full of people who had come not just to listen, but to witness transformation. The photo would later circulate widely, printed in newsletters, shared on local news, and posted on social media under headlines like "Grace in Action" and "The Power of Truth." But for Margaret, it wasn't about the photo or the attention. It was about standing in front of her community and saying, "I was wrong," and knowing in her bones that healing didn't come from perfection. It came from accountability. It came from letting others see your broken parts and inviting them to walk with you as you tried to put them back together. That night, as she rode home in Ellen's car, the windows down and the cool night air brushing her face, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not just relief, but peace. She had stood in her truth, and the world hadn't turned away. It had leaned in. It was a crisp spring afternoon when Margaret Whittaker found herself standing once again on the very sidewalk where everything had begun. The same stretch of pavement, the same row of storefronts, even the same mailbox she had passed that day. It was all still there, untouched by the storm that had swept through her life just months before. Yet nothing felt the same. The sidewalk no longer felt like a space of fear, but one of memory, reflection, and quiet triumph. Ellen stood a few feet behind her, keeping a gentle, watchful eye, but letting her mother have this moment alone. Margaret walked slowly, her steps deliberate but steady, the cane in her right hand tapping softly against the concrete. She paused at the corner, gazing across the intersection to the spot where she had first noticed Jalen walking behind her that fateful day. It wasn't difficult to see herself in that moment, clutching her purse, picking up her pace, letting fear dictate her movement. But instead of shame, she felt something else settle in her chest. Understanding. She had traveled a long road since that day, not in miles but in miles of thought, courage, and humility. Behind her, approaching from the other direction, came a familiar figure, tall, youthful, with a quiet energy that somehow always seemed grounded. Jalen reached her side without needing to say a word, their steps falling into rhythm as they walked together, shoulder to shoulder. "It feels smaller than I remember," he said softly. Margaret smiled. "It always does when you come back to the beginning." Jalen looked around. "This is where it all started." She nodded. "Yes, and where something ended too. That day changed me, not just because of the stroke, but because it shattered everything I thought I knew. And then, slowly, something better began to grow." They walked on, turning the corner past a bakery with sunlit windows, where the scent of fresh bread drifted out onto the sidewalk. A young couple held hands nearby, and an elderly man walked his dog with a bright red leash. Everything seemed so normal, so unchanged, and yet Margaret saw it now with different eyes. "You know," she said after a while, "I used to think I was just one person in a big world, too small to make a difference. But then you did. You showed me that one act of kindness, even when undeserved, can ripple out further than we ever expect." Jalen stopped and leaned against a railing, looking at her thoughtfully. "I didn't know what would happen. I didn't do it for a reward. I just didn't want to walk away. And that," Margaret said, "is exactly why it mattered." She turned toward him. "You gave me a chance to change, and I'll spend the rest of my life making sure that change matters." Jalen smiled, not with pride but with a warmth that spoke of a bond forged in something deeper than circumstance. "You already have." As they continued walking, they passed the small park across from the bus stop. Children played on the swings, laughter ringing in the air, while parents watched from benches shaded by leafy trees. A mural had recently been painted on the back wall of a nearby building, bright, bold strokes of color showing people of all ages and backgrounds standing hand in hand. In the center of the mural was a single image that Margaret recognized immediately. A young man kneeling beside a woman, holding her hand as she lay on the ground. The likeness wasn't exact, but the message was unmistakable. She stopped, stunned. "That's us," she whispered. Jalen looked up at the mural and nodded. "A few of the local students painted it. One of them reached out to me after the forum. I didn't know. I wanted it to be a surprise." Margaret felt her eyes sting with tears, not of sadness, but of a profound gratitude that she couldn't quite find the words for. To be represented not as the frightened woman she had once been, but as someone who had grown, who had been part of something healing. That was a gift she had never expected. "You've changed more lives than you realize," Jalen said, his voice low. "Not just mine. That speech you gave, people are still talking about it. It gave others permission to admit their own fears and start letting go of them." She turned to him, her voice trembling. "I never could have done any of it without you." He shook his head. "You did it because you were ready. I just helped you see it." They stood in silence for a long moment, watching the mural catch the late afternoon light. The colors glowed against the brick wall like a living memory, a reminder that something beautiful could rise from even the hardest truths. Finally, Margaret turned back toward the street, the wind lifting the ends of her scarf as she walked. "Let's keep going," she said. "We've got more to see." Jalen fell into step beside her again, the two of them moving forward, not to erase the past, but to carry its lessons with them into whatever came next. And as they walked away from that corner, from the place where fear had once nearly taken her life, it was not fear that followed them, but the quiet certainty that something had come full circle. Not the neat kind of ending found in books, but the real kind, earned through pain, rebuilt through effort, and sealed in the space where two people, once strangers, had chosen understanding over distance, grace over judgment, and connection over fear. Months had passed since Margaret's world had been turned upside down and gently, irrevocably put back together. The city had begun to warm with the soft breath of summer, trees standing fuller, sunlight lasting longer across the sidewalks that now felt like home rather than battlegrounds of unspoken fear. Her life had settled into a quiet rhythm again, but this time it moved to a different kind of music. One composed not of habits and assumptions, but of intention, awareness, and the surprising joy of second chances. She had gone back to volunteering twice a week at the local library, not because she needed to fill time, but because she found meaning in sharing stories with children who reminded her that the future was wide open and unburdened, if only we gave it the chance. Sometimes Jalen would stop by after school or after a shift at the shelter, and they would sit in the reading corner where sunlight fell across the carpet and pages turned in soft rhythm. She still marveled at how seamlessly he had become part of her life, not as a visitor, but as a thread that wove through her days, grounding her in something real. One particular Thursday afternoon, after a reading session with a small group of second graders, Margaret returned home to find Jalen waiting on the front porch, legs stretched out, a soda in his hand. "You look official," he teased, noting the librarian's name tag still clipped to her blouse. She laughed, lowering herself into the rocking chair beside him. "You laugh now, but those kids are a handful. One of them tried to convince me that dragons live under the library." "Maybe they do," he shrugged, sipping his drink. "Books are full of magic, aren't they?" She glanced over at him, her smile soft. "That's what I've always believed." They sat in silence for a while, the way people do when words aren't necessary. It was Jalen who finally spoke, his tone quieter than usual. "I've been thinking about everything that happened," he began. "How weird it is. How something awful can lead to something good." Margaret tilted her head. "You mean the stroke?" He nodded. "Yeah, that moment, it changed you, and it changed me too. I didn't realize how much until I started writing about it in the journal you gave me." She watched him carefully. "What did you discover?" Jalen looked up at the sky, his voice steady. "That I used to think I had to be invisible to stay safe. Keep my head down, stay quiet, don't draw attention. But now I think the opposite is true. I think being seen, truly seen, is the only way things will ever change." Margaret felt her throat tighten. "That's a powerful lesson. It's one you helped me learn," he said, glancing at her. "You didn't just change how you saw me. You let me see you too, the real you, and that mattered." She reached out, touching his hand. "You gave me the courage to be honest, Jalen. You reminded me that we can't rewrite the beginning, but we can choose the ending." He smiled, not out of politeness but with the quiet conviction of someone who had walked through fire and come out whole. "So what's next?" he asked. Margaret looked out across the yard, where the grass swayed gently in the breeze. "I think it's time to do more, to keep talking, sharing, helping others unlearn what I had to unlearn. Maybe even start a community book group, one focused on stories that challenge people. Open hearts." Jalen nodded. "I'd like to be part of that." "Then we'll do it together," she said firmly. "Bridge by bridge." That weekend, they attended a neighborhood gathering hosted at the same community center where Margaret had given her public apology. This time, though, she wasn't on stage. She and Jalen sat among the crowd, surrounded by families, students, shopkeepers, and city workers. At one point, an older gentleman rose to speak. Mr. Carter, Jalen's grandfather, who had traveled from 3 states away to visit his grandson after hearing the story. "When I heard what my grandson did," he said, voice full of pride, "I wasn't surprised. I was proud, yes, but not surprised. Because Jalen comes from a long line of people who choose compassion even when the world gives them every reason not to. And I thank Miss Margaret for seeing that, for helping others see it too." The applause that followed was warm, sustained, but it wasn't just for Jalen. It was for every person who had chosen to lean in instead of turning away, who had dared to look at themselves honestly, and who had stepped forward with grace. That night, Margaret sat on her porch with Ellen and Jalen, a gentle breeze tugging at the edge of the tablecloth, fireflies beginning to glow in the yard. She looked up at the stars and whispered, more to herself than anyone else. If only I had known sooner. Jalen leaned forward. But you know now, and that's what matters. Ellen smiled. And now you're helping others know too. Margaret nodded slowly. Then that's the final lesson, isn't it? That it's never too late to change. Never too late to see someone clearly. Never too late to be better than we were yesterday. And with that, they sat quietly, the night wrapping around them not as a curtain falling, but as a soft reminder that stories never really end. They simply open doors to new ones. And in those new stories, built on honesty, courage, and connection, perhaps we all find our way home. And so, from a moment of fear came a lifetime of understanding. A truth that reminds us all that sometimes, the greatest heroes wear no uniforms, and the most powerful changes begin with a single act of kindness. What started as a silent clutch of a purse became the spark that lit a path toward healing, friendship, and hope. This story isn't just about Margaret and Jalen. It's about all of us, the choices we make, the biases we challenge, and the bridges we choose to build every single day. Thank you so much for spending your time with us and listening all the way through. Your presence means more than you know. If this story touched your heart, made you think, or reminded you of something you've experienced, we'd love to hear from you. Please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our next story, and drop a comment below sharing your thoughts or even your own personal experience with kindness, prejudice, or change. Your words may inspire someone else watching. Until next time, take care of one another, and never underestimate the power of seeing someone, truly seeing them with an open heart.